The office was a cave of knowledge, a place where dim lights flickered over stacks of paper and the low buzz of machinery filled the air. There I sat, surrounded by the towering shelves, my eyes scanning the data from Mars missions that had consumed the better part of my career. My fingers, often unsteady with a tremor I couldn't control, traced the lines of text on the screen. It was in these moments of silent contemplation that I felt the weight of my mind pushing against the barriers of the known universe. The walls of my office bore the burden of my life's work, adorned with accolades that seemed hollow against the vast expanse of space that I studied. I knew every inch of this room, every book in its place, every sample that I had collected over the years. But it was the sight of Mars, glowing red on the monitors, that always held my gaze the longest. The possibility of life there, so close yet so far, was the enigma that had driven me to the edge of reason. In the quiet hours, when the lab had emptied, I often found myself lost in memories. The sharpness of my focus would blur, and now I would remember the first time I looked through a microscope and saw a universe in the petri dish. I recalled the heavy responsibility that settled on my shoulders the day I was chosen to spearhead the Mars project. My office was a reflection of the paradox I lived in, organized, yet chaotic, clinical, yet filled with dreams of alien worlds. The tremor in my hands was the one thing I couldn't hide, a physical manifestation of the inner turmoil that come with peering into the abyss. I had learned to work with it, to steady my hands long enough to complete a task. But it was a constant reminder that there was something beyond my understanding, something that crept ever closer with each piece of data I collected. One night, I remember standing in the briefing room, the buzz of the air system and the stark white walls making it feel more like a hospital than a place where dreams were about to be launched. The fluorescent lights overhead were harsh, casting a sterile glow over the faces of my team. As I stepped forward, the room fell silent. This mission, I began, my voice steady, isn't just a step for NASA. It's a leap for humankind. I saw the weight of my words settle on their shoulders. Their eyes reflected a blend of fear and resolve. I was the captain of the ship, steering them into an ocean of stars and unknowns. The reason for our mission to Mars was as vast and deep as the Hellas Basin itself. When the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter had sent back images of irregular patterns in the dust and sediment layers, patterns that suggested something more than just geological processes, the whole world had leaned in closer to their screens. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a strange pattern in the sediment, but closer examination revealed that these patterns bore a striking resemblance to stromatolites, layered structures formed by microbial mats that trap and bind sedimentary grains. Stromatolites are some of the oldest evidence of life on Earth, with fossil records dating back over 3.5 billion years. They're not just rocks. They are biogenic, created by the activities of microbial communities. On Mars, these structures were smaller, the layers thinner, as if whatever life form had created them had to conserve every bit of energy in a far more hostile environment. The shapes were too orderly, too systematic to be a mere fluke of wind and time. They suggested the past presence of water, and more importantly, of microbial life that could have thrived in the saline mineral-rich waters, a life form that, in its way, might have mirrored the beginnings of life on our planet. We knew that if life once existed on Mars, it likely had to adapt to extreme conditions, the severe cold, the radiation, the lack of liquid water on the surface. These Martian microbes might have lived beneath the surface, where there was more protection and perhaps subsurface brine aquifers that didn't freeze due to their high salt content. Our team head immediately sent us for the training. I watched them in the simulators, tumbling through fake stars in the zero-gravity room. There was sweat beading on foreheads. I stood by, offering advice, my voice calm. Breathe, adjust, and find your center. The technology we had was nothing short of miraculous. I'd spent long hours with the engineers, poring over the exosuits that would be our second skin on Mars, I'd watch as the suits adapted to each astronaut. Their metal joints whispering promises of protection and endurance. I remember the helmets and how they turn our gazes into reflections. And then came the day when everything we'd worked for came together. We stood around a scale model of the lander that would take us to the Hellas Basin. My hand, usually trembling with the weight of our undertaking, was firm as I touched the model. At that moment, I was not an astrobiologist or a team leader. I was an explorer at the edge of humanity's greatest journey. As I went over the final checks, my team suited up, and we were ready to chase the ghost of life in another world. Up there, away from the embrace of Earth, space wrapped around us like an endless sea of ink. It was a different kind of ocean, one without water or waves, but it was deep and vast, and just as mysterious. Out of the portholes, the stars hung like diamonds on black velvet. So many of them, more than you could ever see from the ground. They didn't twinkle like they did on Earth. No air appeared to make them shimmer, just steady points of light piercing the dark. There was Earth, the place we'd called home. It was a marble of blues, greens, and swirls of white, slowly spinning in the endless night. It seemed impossible that everything we knew, every person we'd ever met, was on that little ball floating in the vast nothing. Seeing it like that made you feel small, and made your problems seem tiny. The trip to Mars was long and got you thinking. The cabin of our space carrier was cramped, filled with the hum of machinery and the scent of recycled air. We talked to pass the time, check equipment, or just stare at the stars and let our minds wander. As Mars got closer, it grew from a bright speck to a small red disk. Through the portholes, it went from being just another light to a place, a world with its mountains, valleys, and secrets. It wasn't home, but it was where we were headed. And in the quiet moments between the work and the waiting, it was hard not to get lost in what lay ahead. The blackness between us and Mars was full of possibilities and warnings. It was easy to think too much, to wonder if we were doing the right thing. We hit Mars like an old baseball smacks into a glove, suddenly and full of purpose. Heat shields took the brunt of it, groaning and complaining like an overworked mule. The craft shook hard enough to rattle my teeth, and every shudder traveled up my spine, sending my heart racing. The sound was more than noise. It was physical, a constant hammering against the hull that spoke of the thin line between us and the void. Inside the chaos of the cockpit, we all clung to whatever we could. I had my hands white-knuckle around the armrests, feeling the lander quiver like a frightened animal. My team, their faces tight with focus, exchanged looks, each of us trying to push out a bit of courage to the others. And then, just like that, it was over. The lander settled on the Martian soil. The noise dropped away, and for a moment, all was quiet, like the world was holding its breath. That silence was louder than the roaring descent. A reminder that we'd done something monumental, something crazy. We'd brought life to a place that didn't know the word's meaning. Taking our first step on Mars, it wasn't like anything you'd imagine. There was no crowd cheering, no parade, just us in a dead world. The hatch opened slowly, and we got hit with a view painted all shades of red and orange. The ground crunched under our boots. The dust kicked up and hung there, lazy without much air to push it around. The air, if you could call it that, was nothing like back home. In the shade, it was like stepping into a freezer. In the sun, it was like someone pointing a weak hairdryer at you. The way we sounded in our comm systems, it was all business. But there was an edge to it, like hearing your voice bounce back at you in an empty house. Now standing there, I was caught between a rock and a hard place. There was the scientist in me who was jumping for joy at all the new stuff to learn. But then, there was the other part, the part that couldn't stop the crawl of dread up my neck. Mars was beautiful, yeah, but it was a beauty that didn't want you there. The sky was all wrong too. Not blue, but a rusty color that reminded you that you were millions of miles away from any other living soul. As we moved toward the anomaly that had brought us here, something felt off. It wasn't just some rock or hill in the distance. It was a mark, a spot that didn't look right. It was like Mars had a bruise, and we were heading straight for it. When we first set foot on the distant planet, the mission was clear. We were to set up a base. I remembered the sense of purpose we felt as we unloaded the habitat modules. These were no ordinary tents, but a feat of human engineering. The habitat, designed to withstand the extremes, unfurled like a giant silver lung, breathing life into our new world. My team and I watched in awe as the structure expanded, its panels locking into place with a series of confident clicks. Activating the life support systems was our next task. As we flipped switches and initiated protocols, the machinery hummed to life. The air revitalization system started, purifying our breaths. And when the first bubble of water emerged from the synthesizer, we all paused, knowing the significance of that single droplet. The habitat was stable. And now, we turned our attention to the anomaly we had come to investigate. Our equipment was state-of-the-art, designed to peel back the layers of the planet's mysteries. But when the readings began to fluctuate, unease settled over the team. The data didn't make sense. Numbers jumped, and dials spun seemingly without cause. The Martian terrain stretched before us, an expanse of red that seemed endless. As our rovers trudged on, the landscape revealed its stark beauty. Sunlight played over the dunes and rocks, highlighting their unique shapes and shadows. The isolation felt complete as we moved toward our goal, a site marked by an anomaly that didn't fit with the rest of the Mars we knew. As we drew closer, my team's excitement bubbled like a chemical reaction about to boil over. Yet, beneath it, a thread of dread wove through my thoughts. What would we find there? My hands followed the familiar scientific protocols, but my heart raced with the fear of the unknown. The moment the drill pierced the Martian soil, there should have been resistance. But there was none. It cut through the ground as if invited. We had expected a crunch of ice, a fight against the frozen grip of a barren planet. Instead, we found a silence that screamed that something was amiss. The drill brought up not ice, but a wrong substance. It was dark and shiny, stretching like a nightmare come to life. It was unlike anything we had imagined finding here. How could something be so alive on a planet where life was a dream? The alien mass lay there, a heart beating out of our rhythm. The sunlight touched it, and it began to move. That's when the true horror began. From the mass, a cloud of spores erupted, each particle a silent threat. They filled the air, a haze that seemed almost beautiful until you knew what it was. A horror made of tiny, terrible possibilities. The spores were invisible, but the way they changed, the light coated everything. They settled on our suits and whispered threats of an alien invasion. The team was stunned, frozen for a moment before the instinct to survive kicked in. We retreated, but the base no longer felt like safety. It felt like a trap. The spores were everywhere. We had come to explore, to discover, but what we had found was a terror that threatened to consume us. I tried to make sense of it, to find a scientific explanation for something beyond my understanding. This mass, this network of life, it wasn't just biology. It was a message, a sign that Mars held secrets we were not prepared to understand. However, we sat in our base and tried to forget what we had just experienced. But when the first coughs echoed through the base, we blamed the dust. It was always the dust on Mars, a fine pervasive thing that seemed to worm into our suits and habitats despite our best efforts. But this was different. The coughs turned into gasps, each breath a struggle, as if the air we breathed had turned against us. The changes in my crew were subtle at first. Jackson's hand trembled as he passed me a wrench. I noticed that his skin was slightly too pale, and his veins were standing out stark and dark against the flesh. When I asked if he was alright, he shrugged it off as fatigue caused by the different atmosphere. After a few hours, I noticed the symptoms spread like wildfire. One by one, the crew fell prey to the alien spores we had unknowingly welcomed into our bodies. It began with a stiffness in the joints, a rigidity that made every movement a chore. Their fingernails started to fall off, leaving raw bleeding from their fingers. I watched my crew's bodies betray them, skin becoming translucent, revealing the once hidden networks of veins now darkened with the spores' presence. Sweat on our brows was no longer just a response to exertion. It became a sickly sheen that made the skin underneath look like a thin layer of ice over a dark pond. I remember Lara, our biologist, crying silent tears that mixed with the sweat, her eyes white with a terror that was magnified by the translucence of her flesh. Her tears seemed to be the last human thing about her, as if her body was rejecting the transformation by weeping. The transformation were not just a horror to witness. They were a betrayal by our bodies. Harris, the youngest among us, his limbs contorted, bending in unnatural angles as the spores redirected his muscle growth. It was a grotesque display of human anatomy gone wrong. I remember looking down at my own hands, expecting at any moment to see the creeping blackness under my skin. The suspense was maddening. Each cough, each shiver of my crew was a signal of the horror within, a gruesome reminder of what was coming. I try to maintain a scientific detachment, to observe and record the changes with clinical precision. But the horror was overwhelming. The mad lab became a chamber of nightmares, filled with painful moans as their bodies contorted into something unrecognizable. They were becoming part of an alien landscape, and I could not stop it. As I sat in the mad lab, surrounded by the mutated forms of my crew, that desire turned to ash in my mouth. Memories of Earth played in my mind. Green fields and blue skies. A life so starkly different from the suffocating horror of our Martian tomb. Fighting to maintain my sanity, I was torn between the drive to understand the extremophile that was claiming us and the primal urge to survive. With each step through the habitat, I felt the weight of this internal struggle. Should I continue to study this phenomenon? Or should I flee, seeking safety in the solitude of the Martian desert? The last rational part of my mind recognized that our mission had been doomed from the start. A hubristic endeavor that had reached into the unknown only to pull back a nightmare. As I watched the extremophile flourish, I realized we were not colonists. We were merely the nutrients for a garden of horrors that thrived in the cold, uncaring expanse of space. I was alone in the medical lab, surrounded by the sterile hum of machinery and the faint antiseptic scent that clung to the air. I slit my own blood sample under the microscope, the stark white light casting a glow on the vibrant cells magnified on the screen. They were healthy, aggressively so, and I recalled the gene therapy I had undergone months before our departure. It was a treatment meant to stave off the effects of a genetic disorder, an anomaly in my DNA that made me unique even before this nightmare began. I compared my blood to that of my first officer, whose veins had turned into rivers of darkness under his almost transparent skin. The spores were there in his sample, replicating unchecked, a stark contrast to the absence in my own. A realization hit me, cold and hard. The gene therapy had altered my immune cells and armored them against the alien invasion happening inside my fellow crew. I input the data into the computer. The analysis confirmed my hypothesis, displayed in glaring clinical detail on the screen. I was immune, an unintentional consequence of a completely unrelated treatment. I remember staring in disbelief as the spores began their silent assault on our habitat systems. It was like watching an invisible enemy slowly taking over. I could hear the hiss and crackle of electrical circuits frying, overwhelmed by the infiltrating spores that crept through the wiring like vines in fast forward. One by one, monitors blinked out, the life-giving hum of machinery faltered, and the once steady throb of the life support systems became erratic spasms. They were making holes, not just in the physical wires and panels, but in our hopes. Our advanced technology, which we'd always relied on, was succumbing to these microscopic invaders that knew nothing of mercy or reason. When everything started to fall apart, it felt like I was watching the end of the world in slow motion. The habitat systems were failing one after another. Spores settled on everything like a layer of deadly snow. My crew and I were the only ones left. That shared horror made us stick together, trying to make a stand. We piled up whatever wasn't nailed down against the doors. Our hands were shaking, but we moved with the kind of purpose you find when your back's against the wall. Every crash against our barricades was like a bell tolling, signaling that our time was running out. In those fleeting moments of calm, when the assault from our changed comrades subsided, I felt an immense solitude. It was as if the universe itself had turned its back on us. My thoughts wandered to my family back on Earth. Their images a cruel reminder of all I would never experience again. When I decided to record that final message before activating the self-destruction, the video feed flickered to life. The red light a stark contrast to the dull blue emergency lights that gave my skin a ghostly pallor. My eyes, which had witnessed the collapse of our mission, were heavy with defeat. They looked into the camera, not with the sharp focus of a scientist, but with the resignation of a man who knew his end was near. The content of my message was simple. "We were wrong," I said, my voice a low murmur drowned out by the hum of the air filtration system working overtime. "This organism, it's not just life. It's death in another form. Keep away from Mars. Forget our achievements. Forget the Hellas Basin. Remember only this warning." With the message done, I prepared for the last thing within my power. My fingers, though still steady, were cold as I keyed in the self-destruct sequence. I moved not with urgency, but with a methodical sadness. Each step a goodbye to my life's passion. Before I hit that final button, I took a moment just to be. In that silence, with the red sands of Mars storming against the windows, I thought of Earth's oceans, of the wind in the trees, and of laughter. Then, with a sigh that felt like it carried the weight of the cosmos, I pressed it.
Self-destruct sequence activated.
The countdown began. It beeps oddly mundane for such a monumental act. My last look into the camera was not one of a man triumphant, but one of a man humbled by the forces beyond his control. "Remember us," I whispered. Before the transmission cut.